I've often wondered how to start this story. It's not one I've told before, not even to my closest friends. It feels strange to speak it aloud, as if giving it words might somehow tarnish the fragile beauty of it. But I suppose it starts the way most unexpected stories do, with a moment. A single, ordinary moment that unfolds into something you never could have anticipated. I was in my 60s when it happened, though sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. My hair had already turned gray by then, though I still dyed it to preserve the illusion of youth. My hands were softer than they are now, but they carried the faint traces of time, the lines and spots that reminded me of all the years I had lived, the things I had touched, and the people I had loved. I was married, had been for more than 3 decades. My husband, Mark, was a good man, steady and kind, if a little predictable. Our life together was comfortable, safe. And yet, as I sat in that hotel bar on a warm summer evening, I felt anything but safe. The bar wasn't my idea. That weekend, I had joined a group of friends to celebrate one of their daughters' upcoming weddings. It was a hen-do, though much tamer than the raucous events younger women seemed to enjoy. We were in a city none of us knew, staying in a hotel far fancier than the ones we would have picked on our own. It was all part of the bride's vision for a luxury weekend, complete with spa treatments and cocktails we couldn't pronounce. That night, the others had gone to a rooftop party hosted by someone they'd met earlier in the day. I had begged off, claiming I was tired, but the truth was, I felt out of place. The music, the crowds, the chatter, it all seemed too much for someone like me, a woman who preferred quiet evenings and familiar routines. Still, I wasn't ready to retreat to my room just yet. The thought of lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while the sounds of the city buzzed below, felt unbearably lonely. So, I went to the bar instead, thinking I might sit for a while, have a drink, and watch the world go by. The bar was elegant, with dim lighting and dark wood accents that gave it a timeless feel. I took a seat near the corner, close enough to the other patrons to feel like part of the scene, but far enough away to avoid being noticed. Or so I thought. I ordered a glass of wine, Chardonnay, my go-to, and sipped it slowly, hoping it would soothe the nervous energy I hadn't been able to shake all day. But the nerves persisted, making my hands tremble slightly as I held the glass. I tried to steady myself, gripping the stem more firmly, but the effort only made me feel more self-conscious. I set the glass down and folded my hands in my lap, hoping no one would notice. That's when I saw him. He was seated at the other end of the bar, speaking to the bartender with an ease that immediately caught my attention. He couldn't have been older than 35, though his presence carried a kind of maturity that seemed at odds with his age. His suit was impeccably tailored, the fabric catching the light in a way that spoke of wealth and taste. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me, it was the way he looked at me when he caught me watching him. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I looked away quickly, my cheeks flushing with embarrassment. What on earth was I doing, staring at a man like that? A man who, by all accounts, belonged in a world far removed from mine? But before I could chastise myself further, he was standing, moving toward me with a confidence that made my heart race. I watched him approach, unsure whether to feel flattered or mortified. By the time he reached my table, I was gripping the edge of my seat, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth but not overly polished. There was a warmth to it, a hint of genuine interest that disarmed me. I hesitated, my mind racing with a dozen reasons to say no. But instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said, my voice shakier than I intended. He sat across from me, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "You looked like you could use some company," he said, offering a small, easy smile. I forced a smile of my own, though I could feel my nerves rising with every passing second. Was it that obvious? I asked, attempting to sound light-hearted. "Not at all," he said. "But I'm very good at reading people." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I took another sip of my wine, hoping it would calm me. It didn't. My hand still trembled, and I set the glass down quickly, worried he might notice. "Are you here for work?" he asked, his tone casual. "No," I said, shaking my head. I'm here with friends. A hen do. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and I realized how strange that must have sounded. Women my age didn't typically go to hen parties, or at least, not ones held in upscale hotel bars. I felt the need to explain. It's for a friend's daughter, I added quickly. I'm just tagging along. That sounds fun, he said, though I wasn't sure if he meant it. And are your friends joining you tonight? No, I said, glancing down at my hands. They're at a rooftop party. I wasn't really in the mood. That makes two of us, he said, his smile widening. I came here to avoid a party of my own. I looked up, surprised. Really? I wouldn't have guessed that. He shrugged, his expression softening. I guess we all need a break sometimes. The conversation flowed more easily after that. He introduced himself, Liam, and asked me about the city, the hotel, my thoughts on the wine. I found myself relaxing, though the occasional flutter of nerves still lingered. There was something about him, about the way he spoke and listened, that made me feel seen. Not as an older woman tagging along on a trip, but as a person. A person who mattered. And for the first time in years, I let myself enjoy that feeling. I wasn't sure when my nerves began to quiet, but by the time we were 20 minutes into our conversation, I realized my hands had stopped trembling. Liam's presence had a way of disarming me. He wasn't overly charming or trying to impress me with his wealth, though it was obvious he had plenty of it. Instead, he asked questions that felt genuine, like he was truly interested in my answers. So, what do you do when you're not attending hen dos? He asked, his smile faint but warm. I hesitated. I'm retired, mostly, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. It wasn't something I liked admitting. Retired felt like such a final word, as if I'd reached the end of usefulness. But I keep busy. I volunteer at the library in my town, and I help out at a community garden. That sounds lovely, he said, and there was no trace of condescension in his tone. Gardening, especially. I imagine it's peaceful. It is, I said, feeling myself smile a little. Though I think the real reason I like it is because it reminds me of my grandmother. She had the most beautiful garden when I was growing up. I used to spend hours with her, learning the names of all the flowers. Do you have a favorite? He asked, tilting his head slightly as he leaned in, as though my answer mattered. Lilacs, I said without hesitation. The smell reminds me of home. Liam nodded, his expression softening. Lilacs are beautiful. My mother loved hydrangeas. I think I grew up believing every garden needed at least one bush of them. The mention of his mother surprised me, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the tenderness in his voice when he said it. It made me wonder about him, about the life he led and the people who had shaped him. But I didn't ask. It felt too soon, too personal. Instead, I took another sip of my wine, my eyes flicking to the glass in front of him. What about you? I asked. What do you do? He hesitated, though it was brief enough that I almost missed it. I'm in real estate, he said. I buy and develop properties. I nodded, not entirely sure what that entailed, but unwilling to press. That must keep you busy. It does, he admitted, his tone carrying a trace of something I couldn't quite place, weariness, perhaps. Too busy, sometimes. I wanted to ask more, to understand what that weariness meant, but the question stuck in my throat. Instead, I let the conversation shift to lighter topics, travel, favorite foods, the absurdly long menu at the bar. Liam had a way of making even the smallest exchanges feel meaningful, as though the words themselves mattered less than the connection they created. As the evening wore on, the bar grew quieter. The crowd thinned, leaving behind only a handful of patrons scattered across the room. The jazz trio in the corner had packed up their instruments, replaced by the soft hum of recorded music playing through hidden speakers. The lights seemed dimmer now, casting the room in a warm, intimate glow. I glanced at my watch, startled to see how late it was. I didn't realize how long we'd been talking, I said, feeling a flicker of guilt. My friends would have expected me to be asleep by now, not sitting at a bar with a man half my age. Time flies, Liam said, his smile faint but genuine. I hope that's not a bad thing. No, I said quickly, surprised by my own honesty. It's nice, actually. I looked down at my hands, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. My wedding ring glinted faintly in the dim light, a small, but undeniable reminder of the life I was supposed to return to. For a moment, I felt a pang of shame, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Nothing had happened. Nothing was going to happen. This was just a conversation. And yet, it felt like something more. Can I ask you something? Liam said after a moment, his tone careful but curious. I looked up, meeting his gaze. Of course. Do you ever feel like, he trailed off, searching for the right words. Like life moves so fast that you forget what it's supposed to feel like? The question caught me off guard. I think so, I said slowly. Though for me, it's more like I've gotten so used to the rhythm of my life that I don't question it anymore. Even when it feels like something's missing. Liam nodded, his eyes thoughtful. I know what you mean. It's easy to get stuck in the routine. To let the years go by without asking if they're the ones you want. I felt a strange pang in my chest, a mixture of understanding and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. Is that why you're here tonight? I asked, my voice softer now. He tilted his head slightly, considering my question. Maybe, he said finally. Or maybe I just wanted to see if there was still room for something unexpected. His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding in a way that made me feel both alive and afraid. I wasn't used to this, to the intensity of the moment, to the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the room. I glanced away, reaching for my glass in an attempt to steady myself. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted it to my lips, and I cursed the betrayal of my own body. But Liam didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't comment. Instead, he leaned back slightly, giving me space to breathe. You don't have to answer that, he said gently. I just wanted to ask. We stayed for a while longer, the conversation shifting back to safer topics. But the energy between us had changed, subtle, but undeniable. When Liam finally glanced at his watch, signaling the end of the evening, I felt an unexpected pang of regret. Can I walk you to your room? He asked, his voice low. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I wasn't sure what he meant, or what I wanted him to mean. But after a beat, I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Liam stood as I nodded, his movements fluid and effortless, as though he were used to inhabiting spaces like this. I wasn't. I felt the awkwardness of my every gesture, the way I hesitated before pushing my chair back or fumbled for my bag. He noticed, of course, he noticed, but instead of letting it hang in the air, he offered me a soft, reassuring smile. Shall we? He asked, gesturing toward the door. I rose slowly, trying to collect myself as I slung my bag over my shoulder. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. The thought of walking through the grand lobby beside him, where people might notice us together, made my stomach twist with nervous anticipation. But I didn't want to say no. Not yet. Not to this moment that felt as rare as it was terrifying. The elevator ride was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that stretches and pulses with the weight of unspoken things. I focused on the numbers above the door, watching them blink steadily upward as we ascended. My floor was only a few levels above the bar, but the trip felt endless. Liam stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but not indifferent. I could feel his presence without looking at him, the warmth of him radiating outward. It wasn't just physical, it was something more, something I couldn't quite name. He didn't speak, and neither did I. It was as if we had silently agreed to let the moment be what it was, without trying to define it. When the elevator dinged softly, I jumped, my nerves betraying me once again. I stepped out first, clutching my bag a little tighter than necessary. My hands trembled faintly, but I kept moving, leading him down the carpeted hallway toward my room. The sound of our footsteps seemed impossibly loud, echoing in the stillness of the corridor. As we reached my door, I turned to face him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I fumbled with my bag, searching for the key card that felt maddeningly elusive in the moment. Liam waited patiently, his expression unreadable but kind. When I finally retrieved the card and held it in my hand, I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "This is me," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. It felt like an absurdly small thing to say, given the enormity of what I was feeling. Liam nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you for tonight," he said softly. "I really enjoyed talking with you." I looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "Me too," I said. And it was true. More than I had expected, more than I wanted to admit. There was a beat of silence, the kind that stretched and hovered, begging to be filled. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, urging me to make a choice. To say something, to do something. But what? And then, before I could decide, Liam took a small step closer. "Julie," he said, my name soft on his lips. It felt different when he said it, as though it carried more meaning than it should have. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. He was close now, closer than I'd let anyone be in years. His eyes held mine, steady and searching, as though he were waiting for permission. Not pressing, not demanding, just waiting. I wanted to say something, to explain what I was feeling or why I was so afraid. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, the key card clenched tightly in my hand, as 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. The weight of my wedding ring felt heavy now, unbearably so, and I resisted the urge to hide my hand. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," Liam said, his voice low and sincere. "If you want me to go, just say the word." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat refusing to budge. I should have told him to go. I should have thanked him for the evening and wished him good night. But instead, I found myself stepping back, sliding the key card into the slot, and opening the door. The room was quiet and dim, the faint glow of the city lights spilling in through the sheer curtains. I stepped inside, leaving the door open behind me. My heart was racing now, so loud I could hardly hear anything else. I set my bag down on the desk, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. Liam followed, his movements unhurried, his presence filling the space without overwhelming it. He closed the door softly behind him, the sound muffled but decisive. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, electric, but neither of us made the first move. I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. He was watching me, his expression softer now, almost vulnerable. "Julie," he said again, and the sound of my name made my stomach flip. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I don't usually," I trailed off, feeling foolish and exposed. "You don't have to explain," Liam said gently. He paused, taking a small step closer. "I just want to be here. With you." The sincerity in his voice was almost unbearable. It wasn't a line, not something rehearsed or calculated. It was real, and that made it all the more difficult to process. I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I even realized I was crying, and I quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing." "You don't have to be sorry," Liam said softly. "We can just talk, if that's what you want. Or I can go. It's entirely up to you." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years, understanding. Not pity, not condescension, but genuine understanding. And for the first time in a long time I felt seen. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and impossible decisions. I could still feel the faint warmth of Liam's gaze on me, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. Instead, I stared at the floor, the familiar hum of my anxieties rising like a tide in my chest. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered again, the words more for myself than for him. My hands clutched the edge of the desk, my knuckles white with the effort of holding on. Liam didn't move closer, didn't try to touch me. Instead, he stayed where he was, giving me space to process the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "Sometimes it's okay to just feel." Feel. It seemed like such a simple concept, and yet it was one I had spent years avoiding. Feeling led to complications, to vulnerability, to the risk of being hurt or making mistakes. It was easier to live in the realm of certainty, of plans and predictability. But as I stood there, trembling under the weight of it all, I realized how much I had missed, how much I had let myself go numb. "I'm married," I blurted out, the confession spilling from me like a dam breaking. My voice was louder than I intended, and the words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Liam nodded, his expression calm but not indifferent. "I know," he said quietly. "I saw your ring." I glanced down at my hand, the gold band gleaming faintly in the dim light. The sight of it sent a pang through my chest, a reminder of the life I had built with Mark. A good life. A safe life. A life that felt distant and hollow in this moment, standing here with a man who made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. "I shouldn't be here," I said, my voice shaking. "I shouldn't have let this." "You haven't done anything wrong," Liam interrupted gently. "We've been talking. That's all." "But it's not just talking," I said, my eyes filling with tears. "It's more than that, isn't it? I can feel it. And I know you can too." The honesty of my words startled me. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even fully acknowledged them to myself until that moment. But now that they were out, I couldn't take them back. Liam didn't deny it. He didn't try to brush it off or pretend it wasn't true. Instead, he nodded, his expression softening. "You're right," he said. "It is more than that. But that doesn't mean it has to be anything you're not ready for." I sank into the chair by the desk, my hands trembling as I pressed them to my lap. "I don't understand you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You could be with anyone. Someone younger, someone who—" I stopped, shaking my head as the words caught in my throat. "Someone who isn't married?" Liam finished for me, his tone light but not unkind. He pulled a chair from the small table by the window and sat down across from me, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "Maybe. But that's not the point." "Then what is the point?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why me?" Liam leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Because when I saw you at the bar, you looked like you were holding your breath. Like you'd been holding it for years, and you didn't even realize it." He paused, his gaze steady but gentle. "And I wanted to see what would happen if you let yourself exhale." His words hit me like a wave, washing over the carefully constructed walls I had spent so long building. He was right. I had been holding my breath, living a life that was quiet and safe, but also stifling. I had convinced myself that it was enough, that I didn't need more than the stability and predictability of my marriage, my routines, my quiet little world. But deep down, I had always known something was missing. I just hadn't let myself feel it. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to let go." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Liam said. "Just take it one moment at a time. And if it's too much, we stop. No questions, no pressure." The simplicity of his words was almost unbearable. He wasn't asking for promises or commitments. He wasn't trying to push me into something I wasn't ready for. He was offering me a choice, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could make it. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. I stared at my hands, at the wedding ring that symbolized so much of my life, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I thought of Mark, of the life we had built together, the years we had shared. I thought of the nights I had spent lying awake, feeling the distance between us like a canyon I couldn't cross. And then I thought of Liam, of the way he had looked at me, spoken to me, listened to me. The way he had seen me not as a wife, a retiree, or a woman who had long since faded into the background of her own life, but as a person. A person who mattered. I took a deep breath, the kind that felt like stepping into uncharted territory. "Okay," I said finally, my voice soft but steady. "One moment at a time." Liam nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for me. Instead, he stayed where he was, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. "That's all we need," he said. The moment I said okay, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, not a flood of clarity or a sudden burst of courage, but a quiet, trembling acknowledgement that I was stepping into a space I'd never dared enter before. I still wasn't entirely sure what I wanted or where this was going, but I knew I couldn't retreat now. Not yet. Liam sat across from me, his presence steady and patient, like he was waiting for me to find my footing. He didn't rush me or try to fill the silence. Instead, he simply held the space, giving me the time I needed to sort through the chaos in my mind. "Would you like some water?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the stillness without disrupting it. The question startled me, its gentleness catching me off guard. I nodded, grateful for the offer, and watched as he moved to the small minibar in the corner of the room. He poured a glass and handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine briefly in the exchange. The contact was fleeting but electric, a jolt that sent my pulse racing. "Thank you," I murmured, taking a sip. The coolness of the water steadied me, anchoring me in the present moment. "You're nervous," Liam said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. "It's okay to be." I glanced up at him, embarrassed by how transparent I must have seemed. "I'm not used to this," I admitted. "Any of this?" "Neither am I," he said, surprising me. I raised an eyebrow. "That's hard to believe." He smiled faintly, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I mean it," he said. "I don't usually do this either." There was a sincerity in his voice that I couldn't ignore. It didn't make the situation less complicated, but it did make it feel less like a game. Whatever this was, it wasn't calculated. It was real. The air between us shifted again, heavy with possibility. Liam returned to his chair, sitting close enough that I could feel his presence, but not so close that it overwhelmed me. I set the glass of water down on the desk, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady myself. "I keep thinking I should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That this is wrong." "It's not wrong to feel," Liam said gently. "And it's not wrong to want connection. To want to be seen." His words struck a chord deep within me, a truth I had tried to ignore for years. I thought of Mark, of the quiet life we had built together. It wasn't an unhappy life, but it wasn't a deeply connected one either. Over the years, we had settled into a comfortable rhythm, one that left little room for passion or vulnerability. And though I had accepted it as the natural course of a long marriage, a part of me had always yearned for more. "I've been married for 35 years, I said, my voice trembling. I stopped, struggling to find the words. "You don't have to explain," Liam said. "This doesn't have to be about what you've done or haven't done. It can just be about this moment. About what you want right now." What did I want? The question felt impossibly large, too complex to answer in the span of a heartbeat. But as I looked at Liam, at the softness in his eyes, the patience in his expression, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Desire. Not just physical desire, though that was part of it, but a deeper longing to be held, to be touched, to be seen in a way that felt raw and real. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice breaking under the weight of the confession. Liam nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I know," he said. "But you don't have to be." He reached out then, his hand moving slowly toward mine. He didn't touch me right away, giving me the chance to pull back if I wanted to. But I didn't. Instead, I let him take my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. The contact was simple, almost chaste, but it sent a rush of warmth through me. I looked down at our hands, at the way they fit together, and felt the tears welling up in my eyes again. It's been so long, I whispered. Since I. Liam squeezed my hand gently, cutting off my words without interrupting me. You don't have to explain, he said again. Just let yourself feel it. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, our hands clasped between us. I could feel the tension in my body slowly start to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of trust. Trust in him, yes, but also in myself, in my ability to navigate this moment without losing myself in it. When Liam finally moved closer, it was slow, deliberate. He released my hand and rested his palm lightly against my cheek, his touch warm and grounding. I closed my eyes, leaning into him without meaning to, and felt the first tear slip down my face. Julie, he said softly, my name a quiet prayer on his lips. Tell me what you want. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. The question felt enormous, but his expression held no judgment, no expectation. He wasn't asking me to commit to anything or make promises I couldn't keep. He was simply asking me to be honest. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. But I don't want to be alone tonight. You don't have to be, he said, his voice steady and sure. And just like that, the line I had been teetering on was crossed, not in a rush, but in a series of small, deliberate steps. Liam's arms around me, his lips brushing against mine, the warmth of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't frantic or hurried, it was slow, tender, and impossibly real. For the first time in a long time, I let myself exhale. The following morning, the first thing I noticed was the light. It streamed through the curtains, soft and golden, casting faint patterns across the walls. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, caught between the remnants of sleep and the weight of waking reality. The sheets were tangled around me, the faint scent of cologne lingering in the air, a scent that wasn't mine. And then it all came rushing back. I didn't move at first, too overwhelmed to do anything but breathe. My thoughts tumbled over one another, fragmented and chaotic. The warmth of Liam beside me, the softness of his touch, the quiet intimacy of a night that felt as fragile as it was profound. It had been real, more real than anything I'd allowed myself to feel in years, and now it was morning. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of him. Liam was still asleep, his breathing slow and even, his face softened by the glow of the morning light. He looked younger somehow, less composed, but no less beautiful. Watching him like that, so unguarded, I felt an ache I couldn't quite name, something between longing and regret. I looked away quickly, afraid of what might surface if I lingered too long. My gaze fell to my hand resting on the sheet, the gold band of my wedding ring gleaming in the sunlight. The sight of it sent a pang through my chest, and I pulled my hand back, tucking it beneath the covers as though that could erase the weight of what I'd done. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to disturb him. My clothes were scattered across the room, a mess of discarded fabric that felt too brazen in the light of day. I gathered them quickly, the familiar sensations of shame and self-consciousness prickling at the edges of my thoughts. My hands trembled as I pulled on my blouse, the buttons slipping between my fingers as I struggled to steady myself. By the time I was dressed, my heart was pounding in my chest, the air in the room suddenly too thick to breathe. I glanced at the door, at the freedom it promised, but something held me back. I turned to look at Liam again, and in that moment, he stirred. "Julie," he murmured, his voice low and rough with sleep. His eyes opened slowly, and when they met mine, I felt my stomach flip. There was no confusion in his gaze, no regret. Just a quiet recognition that made it impossible for me to move. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, the words caught in my throat. "Good morning." Liam sat up, the sheets pooling around his waist, and ran a hand through his hair. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable but kind. "You were going to leave, weren't you?" The question startled me, but I didn't deny it. "I didn't want to wake you," I said, though we both knew it wasn't the whole truth. He smiled faintly, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I'm glad you didn't." I looked away, my hands clutching the strap of my bag. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. I don't know what happens now. Nothing has to happen, Liam said gently. We don't have to figure it all out right now. We can just sit with this for a moment. His words were disarming, their simplicity cutting through the storm of my thoughts. I hesitated, then slowly set my bag down and moved to the edge of the bed. Liam reached for my hand, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. Are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with quiet concern. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't know what to feel. That's okay, he said. You don't have to know. His kindness was almost unbearable. It made the ache in my chest swell, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me with even greater force. I've never done anything like this before, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know how to carry it. Liam nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. It's not something you have to carry alone, he said. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, it wasn't just you. It was us. The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe him, to let myself feel the connection we had shared without questioning its validity. But I couldn't ignore the part of me that was already pulling back, retreating into the safety of the life I had left behind. I should go, I said, my voice soft but firm. Liam didn't argue. He released my hand, his touch lingering for just a moment before falling away. If that's what you need, he said. But before you do, can I say one thing? I nodded, my throat tight. I meant what I said last night, he said. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to let yourself feel. The words hit me like a wave, both comforting and overwhelming. I nodded again, unable to speak, and rose to my feet. I picked up my bag, my movements mechanical, and crossed to the door. My hand hovered over the handle for a moment before I turned back to him. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. For everything. Liam smiled, a soft, understanding expression that made my chest ache. Take care of yourself, Julie. I stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me. The sound echoed in the quiet corridor, final and absolute. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the handle, before I forced myself to move. Each step back to my room felt heavier than the last, the weight of what had happened settling over me like a shroud. By the time I reached my door, I felt the first tear slip down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly, but it was no use. The dam had broken, and the emotions I had held back all morning came rushing to the surface. I wasn't sure what I was crying for Liam, for Mark, for myself. For the life I had built, the life I had just disrupted, the life I didn't yet know how to return to. All I knew was that I couldn't undo what had happened. And no matter how much I tried, I couldn't pretend it hadn't changed me. By the time I stepped back into my hotel room, the weight of the night felt heavier than ever. The door clicked shut behind me, and I leaned against it for a moment, closing my eyes and letting the silence settle around me. I had wanted to escape from that bar, that room, from Liam's steady gaze and quiet understanding, but now that I was here, I wasn't sure where I had run to. The bed was still neatly made, untouched from the night before. I hadn't even pulled the covers back when I left for the bar, thinking I would return within an hour or two. The sight of it, the mundane predictability of the space, felt like a cruel contrast to the whirlwind of emotions I was carrying. I set my bag down on the chair in the corner, then sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I stayed like that for a long time, staring at the floor and trying to piece together what had just happened. The intimacy of the night, the way Liam had seen me, touched me, spoken to me, it all felt like a dream, impossible and fleeting. And yet, the ache in my chest, the warmth that still lingered on my skin, told me it had been real. Uncomfortably, undeniably real. Mark's face flashed in my mind, unbidden. I pictured him at home, sitting in his favorite chair with a cup of tea, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he read the newspaper. He was predictable in every way, steady and constant, like the ticking of a clock. And though I had often resented that predictability, I had also relied on it. It had been my anchor, my safety net. Now, I felt untethered. The sound of my phone buzzing in my bag pulled me from my thoughts. I hesitated, my heart lurching as I reached for it, half expecting to see Mark's name on the screen. But it wasn't him. It was Caroline, one of the women I had come on the trip with. Her name lit up the display, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to face anyone yet, even someone as kind and unassuming as Caroline. But the phone buzzed again, insistent, and I sighed, swiping to answer. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse. "Julie." "There you are," Caroline said, her tone bright and familiar. "We were starting to worry about you. Did you go to bed early last night?" I hesitated, the question feeling heavier than it should have. "Something like that," I said finally. I wasn't feeling up to the party. "Well, we missed you," she said. "We're heading down for brunch in a bit. You should join us." "I don't know if," I started, but she cut me off. "No excuses," she said firmly. "You can't stay cooped up in your room all day. Besides, you'll love the place we're going. It has the most beautiful outdoor seating." Her insistence left little room for argument, and I found myself agreeing, despite the knot of nerves tightening in my stomach. "All right," I said. "Give me a little time to get ready." When I arrived at the cafe, the others were already there, seated at a sunlit table near the edge of the patio. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly brewed coffee. Caroline waved me over, her smile as radiant as the morning light. "There you are," she said, pulling out a chair for me. "We thought you might have gotten lost." "Just running behind," I said, forcing a smile as I settled into the seat. My hands rested on the table, and I folded them tightly to keep them from trembling. The conversation flowed easily around me, light, cheerful, filled with anecdotes about the night before. I nodded along, offering the occasional laugh or comment, but my mind was elsewhere. I felt like I was watching from a distance, removed from the camaraderie of the group by an invisible barrier I couldn't break through. "You're quiet this morning," Caroline said, leaning in slightly. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, the truth pressing against the edges of my lips. But what could I say? That I had spent the night with a man half my age? That I was grappling with a guilt I couldn't even name? I forced another smile, hoping it would mask the turmoil beneath. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired, I think." Caroline studied me for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't press. Instead, she turned back to the group, her laughter ringing out as one of the others recounted a particularly embarrassing dance floor moment. As the meal wore on, I felt myself relax, if only slightly. The warmth of the sun, the steady rhythm of conversation, the clink of silverware against plates, it was all soothing in its familiarity. For a little while, I allowed myself to get lost in it, to push the memories of the night before to the back of my mind. But when we stood to leave, saying our goodbyes and exchanging plans for the afternoon, I felt the weight of it settle over me again. I walked back to the hotel alone, the quiet of the city streets amplifying the noise in my head. The ring on my finger felt heavier with each step, its presence a reminder of the life I was supposed to return to. By the time I reached my room, I felt drained. I sat on the edge of the bed again, staring at the window as the sunlight streamed in. The hours stretched ahead of me, and I had no idea how to fill them. All I knew was that the woman who had walked into that bar last night was not the same one sitting here now. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which one I wanted to be. The hours after brunch passed in a haze. I sat by the window in my hotel room, staring at the city skyline, lost in the jumble of thoughts swirling in my mind. The sunlight glinted off distant buildings, the movement of traffic below a faint hum against the stillness of my space. But none of it registered. I was too consumed by the night before, by what it meant, and by the chasm it had opened inside me. I kept returning to the moment I had crossed the line, that single decision to let Liam into my room. It wasn't a grand, dramatic choice, not one I could point to and say, "There, that's when everything changed." It had been quiet, hesitant, filled with uncertainty. But it had happened all the same. And now, the weight of it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my hand, at the wedding ring that seemed to glint more brightly in the afternoon light. Mark had chosen it himself, surprising me with it when he proposed in the small cafe where we'd had our first date. I could still picture the joy on his face, the way his hands trembled as he slid it onto my finger. It had been a moment of pure love, untainted by the years of routine and quiet distance that had settled over us since. The thought of him now made my chest ache. Mark was a good man, steady and reliable in all the ways Liam was not. He loved me in the way he knew how, with a quiet devotion that had carried us through decades of marriage. But somewhere along the way, the spark between us had dimmed, replaced by the predictable rhythm of a life lived side by side but rarely intertwined. The memories of Liam, by contrast, burned brightly in my mind, vivid and unrelenting. The way he had looked at me, touched me, spoken to me, it had awakened something in me I thought had long since faded. For one night, I had felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And yet, that feeling came at a price. I buried my face in my hands, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of it all pressed down on me. Guilt, regret, longing, they swirled together, indistinguishable and suffocating. I wanted to turn back time, to undo what I had done, but I also wanted to hold on to the memory of it, to keep it tucked away in the quiet corners of my heart. Was it possible to feel both? By evening, I couldn't sit still any longer. The walls of the hotel room felt like they were closing in on me, the air thick and stifling. I grabbed my bag and left, not knowing where I was going but unable to stay. The city streets were alive with the buzz of nightlife, couples and groups moving together in an endless current of energy and sound. I walked aimlessly, letting the movement of the crowd carry me, my thoughts too scattered to notice the direction I was heading. Eventually, I found myself in a small park, the kind of quiet oasis that cities often tucked away amidst the chaos. The air was cooler here, the faint scent of flowers and earth grounding me in a way I hadn't felt all day. I sat on a bench near a fountain, the sound of the water soothing the restless hum in my mind. For a long time, I simply sat there, watching as the city moved around me. Couples strolled past, their laughter mingling with the distant strains of music from a nearby cafe. A woman walked her dog, her soft voice drifting through the night as she spoke to it. And then there were the lone figures, like me, lost in their own thoughts, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights. I wondered what their stories were, what secrets they carried, and if they felt as untethered as I did. It was a strange comfort, this anonymity, this realization that I was just one of many people trying to make sense of their choices and their lives. As I sat there, the memories of Liam began to shift. They became less about the guilt and more about the connection we had shared. For one night, he had seen me, not as a wife, a retiree, or a woman past her prime, but as a person. A person with desires, fears, and a yearning for something more. And for that, I couldn't hate him. I couldn't even hate myself, though the temptation was strong. Instead, I began to see that night for what it was, a reminder. Not of what I lacked in my marriage or my life, but of what I was still capable of. Of feeling, of connecting, of being vulnerable in a way I hadn't let myself be in years. When I finally returned to the hotel, the city lights sparkling against the night sky, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The ache in my chest hadn't gone away, it likely wouldn't for a long time, but it had softened, its edges less jagged. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing, I couldn't let this moment define me. Not entirely. I had made a choice, and now I had to decide what to do with it. Whether to carry it as a burden or as a lesson. Whether to let it pull me further into myself or to use it as a way to open up, to rediscover the parts of me I had hidden away for so long. As I lay in bed that night, the familiar rhythm of the city lulling me to sleep, I found myself thinking of Mark. Of the life we had built together, imperfect, but real. I didn't know how to reconcile that life with what I had done, but I knew I had to try. For both of us. And for myself. The train ride home felt longer than usual, though I knew it wasn't. The same trees blurred past the window, the same countryside rolled on in its quiet monotony, but I couldn't sink into the rhythm of it. My thoughts were too loud, and the weight of what I was bringing home with me, unseen but no less present, pressed down like an invisible stone. The others from the trip were in good spirits, chatting about the weekend, laughing at jokes I couldn't follow. Caroline sat beside me, her voice light and cheerful as she recounted her favorite moments to someone across the aisle. I smiled when it felt appropriate, nodded when she turned to include me, but my heart wasn't in it. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy their company. These women had been my friends for years, and their laughter had always been a source of comfort. But now, it felt like a buffer between me and my thoughts, something I both appreciated and resented. I wanted to sink into their joy, to lose myself in the mundane chatter of spa treatments and wedding plans, but I couldn't shake the memory of Liam. The way he'd looked at me, spoken to me, touched me. It felt like a shadow following me home, one I couldn't outrun. Mark was waiting for me at the station, as he always was. He stood by the car, his familiar figure a steady presence in the bustling crowd. He waved when he saw me, his smile small but warm, the kind of smile I'd come to depend on over the years. "Welcome back," he said as I approached, reaching for my bag. He kissed me on the cheek, a gesture so automatic it might as well have been muscle memory. "How was the trip?" "It was nice," I said, forcing a smile as I climbed into the car. "Relaxing." "That's good," he said, settling into the driver's seat. "You deserve it." The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't unusual for us. Mark wasn't a man of many words, and our silences had become comfortable over time. He asked a few questions about the trip, how the hotel was, if I enjoyed the spa treatments, and I answered them as best I could, careful to keep my tone light and casual. It wasn't until we pulled into the driveway that I realized how tightly I had been gripping my hands in my lap. The sight of our house, familiar and unchanging, brought a strange pang of relief and dread. This was my life, my world, the one I had built with Mark. And yet, it felt different now, as though it didn't quite fit anymore. Mark carried my bag inside, setting it down by the stairs. "I'll put the kettle on," he said, heading toward the kitchen. It was his way of welcoming me home, the routine as steady and predictable as everything else about him. I followed him into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he busied himself with the teapot and mugs. "How was your weekend?" I asked, more out of obligation than curiosity. "Quiet," he said, glancing at me briefly. "I went golfing with Jim on Saturday, and the rest of the time I just caught up on some reading." "Nothing exciting?" I nodded, watching him as he poured the water into the teapot. His movements were practiced, deliberate, the same way he did everything. For a moment, I felt a wave of affection for him, for the steadiness that had carried us through decades of marriage. But that affection was quickly followed by guilt, sharp and unrelenting. "You seem tired," Mark said, handing me a cup of tea. "Did you sleep well?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the mug. "Not really," I admitted. "I think I'm just a little worn out from the trip." He nodded, his expression sympathetic. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" "I'll take care of dinner." "Thank you," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. I retreated to the bedroom, setting my tea on the nightstand and sinking onto the edge of the bed. The room was exactly as I had left it, neat, quiet, unchanging. But as I sat there, I felt like a stranger in my own space. The bed I had shared with Mark for so many years, the walls that held the memories of our life together, it all felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else. I thought of Liam then, of the way he had looked at me as though he could see right through me. The connection we had shared, however fleeting, felt more vivid in my mind than anything else. And yet, here I was, back in the life I had chosen, the life I had built. I didn't know how to reconcile the two. That evening, as Mark and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, I felt the silence between us more acutely than ever. It wasn't uncomfortable or strained, it was the kind of silence we had grown used to, filled with the unspoken understanding that came with years of marriage. But now, it felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of everything I couldn't say. "How's your tea?" Mark asked, breaking the quiet. "It's good," I said, forcing a smile. "Thank you." He nodded, returning his focus to his plate. I watched him for a moment, the way he held his fork, the faint lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years. He was a good man, a man who had stood by me through everything. And yet, I felt the distance between us like a canyon I couldn't cross. "I missed you," he said suddenly, his voice soft. The words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, my heart aching. "I missed you too," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was entirely true. I had missed the idea of him, the comfort of home, but the feelings were too tangled to name. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the light from the window. I didn't know what to do, how to move forward, or how to carry the weight of what had happened. All I knew was that the woman who had left for that trip wasn't the same one lying here now. And I didn't know how to explain that to anyone, least of all myself. The days after my return passed in a blur of routine. Mark and I fell back into the quiet rhythm of our lives together, shared meals, evenings spent reading or watching television, the occasional exchange of plans for the week. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, I felt like I was splintering. Every quiet moment seemed louder now, filled with the echoes of Liam's voice, the memory of his touch, and the weight of the choices I had made. I tried to push it down, to bury it beneath the mundane tasks of daily life, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. One morning, a few days after my return, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, while Mark read the newspaper at the table. The sound of the faucet running and the faint rustle of pages should have been comforting, but instead, they felt oppressive. My thoughts were too loud, my guilt too sharp, and I couldn't bear the silence anymore. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Yes?" I hesitated, gripping the edge of the sink as I tried to steady myself. I had no idea what I was about to say, only that I needed to say something. "Do you ever feel like we've lost something?" Mark set down the newspaper, his brow furrowing slightly. "Lost something? What do you mean?" I turned to face him, my hands still wet from the dishwater. "I don't know," I said, my voice faltering. "It's just, I feel like we've been on autopilot for so long. Like we're just here." Mark's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "Julie, we've been married for a long time. It's natural for things to feel steady. Maybe even predictable. But that doesn't mean we've lost anything. Doesn't it?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "Because sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions. Like we're not really connected anymore." Mark was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Is that how you feel?" he asked finally. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "Yes. And I don't know how to fix it." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I hadn't meant to say them, hadn't planned to open this door, but now that I had, I couldn't close it again. Mark looked at me, his face a mixture of concern and sadness. "Julie," he said softly, "I'm sorry if I've made you feel that way. I've never stopped loving you. You know that, don't you?" His words hit me like a wave, both comforting and painful. "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "And I love you too. But I don't know if that's enough anymore." Mark stood then, crossing the room to stand beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steady and familiar. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Tell me, and I'll do it." His sincerity was almost unbearable, and I felt the tears spill over. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what I need." For the rest of the day, the conversation lingered between us, unspoken but present. Mark didn't press me further, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the way he watched me with a quiet intensity that wasn't like him. I didn't have the heart to tell him about Liam, not yet, maybe not ever. It wasn't just guilt holding me back. It was the fear that saying it aloud would shatter something I wasn't ready to lose. That evening, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us felt different. It wasn't the easy, comfortable quiet we had grown used to. It was heavier, more charged, filled with the weight of all the things we weren't saying. Do you want to go for a walk? Mark asked suddenly, breaking the stillness. I looked up, startled. A walk? Yeah, he said, offering a small smile. It's a nice night. And I feel like we could both use some fresh air. I hesitated, then nodded. All right. The air outside was cool and crisp, the faint scent of blooming flowers carried on the breeze. We walked slowly, side by side, neither of us speaking at first. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights casting soft shadows across the pavement. After a while, Mark spoke. I know things haven't been perfect, he said. And I know I've probably taken you for granted more than I should have. But I want to do better. I want to be better, for you, for us. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Mark, it's not just you, I said. It's me too. I think I've been holding back. Not letting myself feel things. Not letting myself need things. Mark stopped walking, turning to face me. Then let's figure it out together, he said. Whatever it takes. In that moment, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I thought of Liam, of the connection we had shared, and the way it had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But I also thought of Mark, the man who had stood by me through everything, who was here now, offering to try even when he didn't fully understand what I needed. I want that too, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know how, but I want to try. Mark nodded, his expression softening. We'll figure it out, he said. One step at a time. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts still restless, but quieter now. The truth of what had happened with Liam was still mine to carry, but I realized I didn't have to let it define me. It had been a moment, a complicated, beautiful, painful moment, but it didn't have to be the end of anything. Instead, it could be the beginning of something new. In the days and weeks that followed, Mark and I tried to find our footing. It wasn't easy, not at first. The years of routine we had settled into weren't easily broken, and the quiet distance that had grown between us didn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in what felt like years, we were both trying. And that, I realized, was a beginning. Mark's efforts surprised me in ways I hadn't expected. He asked more questions about my days, took more interest in the little things I talked about, books I was reading, plants I was tending in the garden, conversations I had with friends. He started suggesting outings, walks to the park, lunches at small cafes we hadn't visited in years, even a trip to the cinema to see a film neither of us had heard of. They weren't grand gestures, but they didn't need to be. They were moments of connection, small acts that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. And yet, I couldn't entirely shake the shadow of Liam. Not him specifically, he hadn't reached out, and I didn't expect him to, but what he represented. The part of me that had awakened in his presence, the woman I had allowed myself to be for that one night. She was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, reminding me that I was capable of more than I had let myself believe. One evening, as Mark and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he spoke again about our marriage. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his voice soft but steady. About us. About what we've lost. I turned to look at him, surprised by his openness. And what do you think? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. I think you're right, he said. We have lost something. Or maybe we've just let it slip away, bit by bit, without realizing it. His honesty caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. It's not just you, I said quickly. I let it happen too. I let myself disappear. Mark nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe we both did. But that doesn't mean we can't find our way back. I smiled faintly, though my chest ached with the weight of his words. Do you really believe that? I do, he said. But only if we're willing to try. And so, we did. We tried in ways that felt awkward at first, fumbling through conversations that were more honest than we were used to. We talked about the things we missed, about the small gestures that had once defined our love but had been lost to the years. Mark admitted that he had taken our life together for granted, assuming it would always be enough. And I confessed that I had stopped asking for what I needed, afraid of disrupting the fragile balance we had created. It was painful at times, those conversations. They forced us to confront truths we had ignored for too long. But they also reminded me why I had chosen Mark in the first place. Beneath his quiet demeanor and steady presence was a man who cared deeply, who was willing to fight for what we had even when it felt like it was slipping away. For me, the process of forging a new path wasn't just about Mark, it was about myself. Liam had shown me that I was capable of more, of wanting more, and I knew I couldn't ignore that. I started doing small things to reconnect with the person I had been before marriage, before routine, before I had let myself fade into the background of my own life. I joined a painting class at the local community center, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. The act of creating, of losing myself in the strokes of a brush, felt liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I spent more time in the garden, not just tending to the plants but sitting among them, letting the quiet beauty of the space soothe me. I even started keeping a journal, pouring out my thoughts and fears in the privacy of its pages. Through it all, Mark was there, steady and supportive. He didn't ask about the changes I was making, but he noticed them. And though I didn't tell him about Liam, I felt the weight of that secret begin to shift. It wasn't something I could undo, but it didn't have to define me, or us. It was a part of my story, one I carried quietly but no longer let consume me. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Mark turned to me with a hesitant smile. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking we should take a trip. Just the two of us." "A trip?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," he said, his expression softening. "Somewhere new. Somewhere we've never been before." I paused, the idea settling over me like a warm blanket. "I think I'd like that," I said finally. Mark's smile widened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Not the kind that comes from grand gestures or sweeping changes, but the quiet kind that grows slowly, moment by moment, until it becomes something unshakable. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, I thought about the journey we were on, not just as a couple, but as individuals. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy. But it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like we were moving towards something rather than just holding on. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this: I was ready to meet it. With Mark, with myself, with the knowledge that even the most complicated moments can lead to something beautiful. The trip Mark suggested turned out to be one of the best decisions we'd made in years. We settled on a small coastal town, a place neither of us had been before but had heard about from friends. It wasn't extravagant, just a few days away in a quiet bed and breakfast overlooking the sea, but it felt perfect. The change of scenery offered us both a chance to breathe, to step away from the routines and responsibilities of home and focus on what truly mattered. It wasn't an escape, not entirely, but it was a pause. A chance to reflect on where we were and where we wanted to go. On our first morning there, we walked along the beach as the sun rose over the horizon. The sand was cool beneath our feet, the air crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed. Mark held my hand, his grip steady but gentle, and for the first time in a long while, I felt grounded. "This is nice," he said, his voice soft. "It is," I agreed, my gaze fixed on the waves lapping at the shore. "It's peaceful." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think we needed this." "We did," I said, squeezing his hand lightly. "Thank you for suggesting it." He smiled, a small but genuine gesture, and we continued walking in comfortable silence. It wasn't the silence of the past, the kind that felt heavy with things left unsaid. This was different. It felt easy, natural, like we were both content simply being in each other's presence. Later that day, as we sat on the porch of the bed and breakfast, sipping tea and watching the seagulls circle overhead, Mark spoke again about the changes we had been trying to make. "I know it's going to take time," he said, his voice quiet but firm. And I know it's not going to be perfect. But I want you to know how much I appreciate you, Julie. For being honest with me. For giving us a chance. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I wasn't sure you'd want to try, I admitted. When I said all those things, I was so afraid it would push you away. Mark shook his head, his gaze steady. You didn't push me away, he said. You made me realize how much I've taken for granted. How much I've taken you for granted. The tears I had been holding back spilled over then, and I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. I don't want to lose us, I said, my voice trembling. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want to try too. I want us to be better. Mark nodded, his eyes glistening. We will be. We already are. In the days that followed, I felt a shift between us. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of change that sweeps you off your feet. It was quieter, subtler, a growing sense of connection that had been missing for too long. We laughed more, talked more, and even sat in silence more comfortably, the weight of unspoken things slowly lifting. For the first time in years, I felt like we were moving forward together. But finding peace wasn't just about my relationship with Mark. It was also about making peace with myself, with the choices I had made, the woman I had become, and the woman I still wanted to be. Liam lingered in my thoughts, not as a source of guilt or regret, but as a reminder. He had shown me a part of myself I had forgotten, a part that still mattered. And while I would never see him again, his presence had left an indelible mark on my life. One evening, back at home, I sat in the garden with my journal, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. I opened it to a blank page and began to write, not about Liam, not directly, but about the way he had changed me. About the courage it took to confront the parts of myself I had buried, the strength it took to face the truth of my marriage, and the hope I felt now, moving forward. As I wrote, I felt a sense of clarity settle over me. Liam wasn't the answer to my questions, nor was he the cause of them. He had simply been a moment, a beautiful, complicated moment, that had shown me the way forward. And for that, I was grateful. That night, as Mark and I sat on the couch, his arm draped loosely over my shoulders, I felt a quiet sense of peace. Our journey was far from over, and there would be challenges ahead, but I knew we were in it together. And that was enough. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel torn between who I was and who I wanted to be. I felt whole. Imperfect, yes, but whole. As I lay in bed that night, the familiar rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me, I closed my eyes and let the memories of the past few months wash over me. The laughter, the tears, the moments of doubt and clarity. They had all brought me here, to this place of quiet contentment. And as sleep claimed me, I whispered a silent prayer, not of regret, but of gratitude. For Mark. For Liam. For the lessons I had learned and the life I was still building. For the peace I had finally found. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.